All right, what's up, everyone? My name's Ross. We'll begin this webinar in just a second. Just want to get a quick confirmation that y'all can hear me and see me before we begin. Please let me know in the chat section that you can come through loud and clear. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Ariana. Let's begin then. Awesome. Well, welcome, everyone. Real excited to be here with y'all today. As I mentioned, my name is Ross. I am the Director of Content and Instruction over at LSATMax. I've been working in the LSAT space for almost 10 years now, teaching the LSAT extensively, making educational content for the LSAT, writing about the LSAT, and also holding webinars like this one about the LSAT, about all the tips we can provide on this test. Now, what we're going to do today, I'm really excited to do because when I first started teaching the LSAT, Ctrl+F as a method, as a tool we could use on the LSAT just did not exist. When I first started teaching the LSAT was actually given in paper booklets, used a Scantron. This Ctrl+F computer-based search function wasn't available to us. In fact, even when the LSAT initially went digital in 2019, still couldn't use Ctrl+F. It wasn't until 2020, when the LSAT became an at-home test, that this feature became available to test takers. And I really wanted to hold a webinar on Ctrl+F because a lot of people who've been teaching the LSAT for a long time, like me, have this new tool available to them. But it wasn't a tool that they used when they were studying for the LSAT, and it wasn't a tool that they really taught because, as I mentioned, it wasn't available for such a long time. And so there isn't a lot of, in my opinion, really good advice out there about Ctrl+F. A lot of us who teach the LSAT haven't really dug into how Ctrl+F can be used effectively and efficiently to help you earn points on the test. And so that was my goal of today's webinar, to really take a hard look at Ctrl+F, review its function on the LSAT, and synthesize that with everything I've learned with working through many students on the LSAT and reading comprehension particularly, to devise a set of guidelines that you can use when using Ctrl+F, so that hopefully you can use this tool to your advantage on this test. And that's going to be the focus of today's presentation, how to use Ctrl+F effectively. It's going to take about 30 minutes to do so, to talk about Ctrl+F. That'll leave the second half of today's presentation to ask me any questions that you might have about the LSAT, whether it's about Ctrl+F or something else related to the LSAT. So here's what today's agenda is going to look like. We're going to start with just a quick explanation of what is Ctrl+F. If you join this webinar and you're like, Ctrl+F, that sounds mysterious. That sounds kind of secretive. What is that? I'll briefly describe what Ctrl+F is so we're all on the same page. I'll then talk about whether we can use Ctrl+F on the LSAT, because believe it or not, there still seems to be a little bit of misinformation out there about the use of Ctrl+F on the LSAT. So spoiler alert, you can use Ctrl+F on the LSAT. We're going to talk a little bit about why there's a kind of persistent belief or misconception that you cannot use Ctrl+F. We're then going to talk about a related but slightly different question: should we use Ctrl+F on the LSAT? And that question is really going to frame the rest of today's webinar. Should we use Ctrl+F? How often should we use it? When should we use it? On what kinds of questions should we use it? Should we use it when we're practicing? Should we use it on test day? Should we use it extensively or not so extensively? How should we use Ctrl+F on the LSAT? And to really help us address that question, what I devised after reviewing Ctrl+F extensively is 4 principles we can use when practicing Ctrl+F on the LSAT. These are 4 rules that I'd like us all to think about and try to incorporate into how we practice using Ctrl+F. Because these 4 principles are going to make sure that we're using Ctrl+F effectively, efficiently, and on the parts of the test where Ctrl+F can really help us yield points. Because if we're using Ctrl+F too much, that might slow us down, that might distract us from what actually matters on a particular question, that might make that question a little bit more confusing, and that sometimes even the worst case might lead us to get that question incorrect. So I devised 4 principles that we can follow when using Ctrl+F. These are principles we want to kind of incorporate into our practice when we're using Ctrl+F in our homework or on our practice tests. And hopefully that will help you devise a system of using Ctrl+F that will help you earn more points on this test. Finally, we're going to talk about how to speak with your proctor about using Ctrl+F. Unfortunately, we've heard some reports that some proctors who actually administrate this test to test takers have not allowed those test takers to use Ctrl+F, even though that is in contravention of LSAC's official policy on Ctrl+F. So we're talking about how to speak with your proctor to guarantee that you can use Ctrl+F in case you want to use that. Like I said, these 5 bullet points are going to take us about 30 minutes in this presentation. That will leave the second half of this presentation for you to ask me anything. Now, if a question ever pops into your head that you'd like answered at the end of today's presentation during that Ask Me Anything section, the easiest place for me to access that question is going to be the Q&A section of this webinar. So please put any questions you have that you'd like answered at the end of today's webinar in that Q&A section. I see a couple of us have already put some questions in the chat section. If you have a question about something I said in the course of today's presentation about Ctrl+F, like, hey, I missed what you just said about Ctrl+F. Hey, I missed that piece of advice. Hey, can you elaborate on this? You can put those kind of questions that necessitate an immediate response in the chat section. But for any question that you'd like answered at the end of today's presentation, why don't you go ahead and put that in the Q&A section. All right, so without further ado, let's begin. As I said, we're going to start off with a quick explainer of what is Ctrl+F. Well, pretty simple. Ctrl+F is a computer-based search function that allows you to find words that are located in a document or web page. It's really a text box that pops up and allows you to search for words. Now, it's relevant for us because that function works on LSAT's digital testing interface. When you sit down to take the real LSAT, you'll connect with your proctor over ProctorU, and they will connect your computer to a digital testing interface that was created by the Law School Admissions Council, LSAC, who write and administer the LSAT. And on that test, which you'll be taking at home on your personal computer, will allow you to use Ctrl+F to search for words on the test. To use Ctrl+F, all you have to do is press and hold Ctrl and the F key simultaneously, or if you're using a Mac, it's Command and the F key, and a text box will appear in the upper right-hand corner of the page, as you can kind of see in this video illustrated below. That will allow you to search for any word that you want. Type a word into that text box, and any appearance of that word on the page will become highlighted. As we can see, this person's searching for the word underground. So you can go ahead and search for that. You can see underground gets highlighted in orange. You can also filter through all the appearances of that word if there's more than one. So you can quickly cycle through all the places where underground can appear. And I imagine a lot of us are kind of having our wheels spinning in our head right now, like, oh, I've been studying for the LSAT for a little bit, reading comprehension, as this video might suggest. So the next part is, if this is so useful, are they going to let us use it on the LSAT? The short answer is yes. You are allowed to use Ctrl+F on the LSAT. I should say they can always change the rules if they want to. So as of today, what is it, June 29th, 2022, you are allowed to use Ctrl+F on the LSAT. When the LSAT became an at-home test in May 2020, LSAC confirmed that it would not disable the Control or Command F search function on their testing software. Test takers who take the LSAT at home on their computer are allowed to use that function. And since May 2020, LSAC has never changed this policy. Test takers continue to use the Control Command+F search function to date. Now, you may have heard online that you're not allowed to use that. Why is that the case? Well, we've heard some reports that some proctors did not allow test takers to use the Ctrl+F search function. Now, this is just a result of those proctors not knowing the specific rules of the test, and those test takers not having a productive conversation about the use of Ctrl+F with their proctors. So these proctors were ill-informed. The test takers, unfortunately, did not do the best job of having a conversation with their proctor to inform their proctor of the rules of the LSAT. So if you hear about test takers not being able to use Ctrl+F on the LSAT, it's far more likely that that is because the proctor just wasn't aware of the rules, because LSAC's official policy remains that you are allowed to use Ctrl+F on the LSAT. In short, Ctrl+F is a tool that will be available to you on the LSAT should you choose to use it. Which is going to bring us to the next question. Should you use Ctrl+F on the LSAT? Is it worth it? Is it going to help you earn points on the LSAT? And this is where the question is a little bit more, the answer to the question is a little bit more complicated than the answer to that last question. Last question, can you use it? Unambiguous, yes. Answer to this question, should you use it? Well, my answer would be yes, you should use it. There are points where Ctrl+F can really help you on the LSAT, but we don't want to abuse that tool because there are some points on the LSAT where Ctrl+F might not help us a lot, or might even make our job harder, or might even lead us astray. Like all tools, Ctrl+F is good for some jobs, but not quite as good for other jobs. If we're going to be effective test takers, we need to use the right tool for the right job. Now, Ctrl+F is going to be a tool that we can use for some jobs, but there's going to be other tools that you acquire. In fact, much more important tools that you acquire throughout your time studying for the LSAT. And there's going to be many questions where you have to use those other tools to get the right answer. So using Ctrl+F effectively is really about choosing the right moments to use Ctrl+F, choosing the right way to use Ctrl+F, and not forgetting about all of those other tools that you have in your toolbox that can also help you get the right answer. Now, if we think about the use of Ctrl+F generally across the LSAT, there are three sections of the LSAT. There's logical reasoning, there's logic games, at least for now, and there's reading comprehension. Now, Ctrl+F doesn't help you really at all in logic games. It's not really necessary on logical reasoning, but it can be used on reading comprehension. So when we think about the use of Ctrl+F on the LSAT, we should really be thinking about its use in just that section of the LSAT. We should use it on reading comprehension. We should use it sparingly on other sections. Now, Ctrl+F can work on reading comprehension because reading comprehension gives you long passages and then many questions about that passage that you're asked to read. And many of the questions in reading comprehension ask you to find pieces of information that are in the passage. In other words, the correct answer to many, but not all, but many questions on reading comprehension will be explicitly supported by information in the passage itself, or at least supported by multiple pieces of information from the passage that you can synthesize and use to support the right answer. Therefore, the Ctrl+F search function can really help us find those specific pieces of information quickly and reliably to find that support we need to select the right answer. So we should use it on reading comprehension to accomplish that goal, finding the support in the passage for the right answer. We should use it sparingly, if at all, on the other two sections. Now, even when we use it on reading comprehension, and this is a point I'm going to dive into deeper in just a little bit, the use of Ctrl+F should be a tool that supplements the critical reading skills on this section. It should not be a tool that replaces your critical reading skills. We need to make sure we think about that passage in the right way, that we break down that passage in the right way, that we understand the broad strokes of that passage in the right way before we think about using Ctrl+F on that passage. Because Ctrl+F, frankly, is not going to help us very much if we don't have a solid working understanding of the entire passage. And I'll show you a passage that kind of illustrates that point in just a little bit. Additionally, it's also important to remember that many test takers may believe that Ctrl+F saves time and energy on just about every question of reading comprehension. Ctrl+F can occasionally slow us down and make our job more difficult on some reading comprehension questions. There are often easier ways to get the right answer than Ctrl+F. There are sometimes more efficient ways to get the right answer than using Ctrl+F. That's not to say Ctrl+F is an invalid way of getting the right answer or an unsound way of getting the right answer, but Ctrl+F is sometimes not the best way. So we want to think about all of these things when we think about should we use Ctrl+F. Yes, it can help. We need to make sure we're using it in the right place, for the right questions, and in the right way. So that kind of brings up this next question of, okay, if we need to be selective with how we use Ctrl+F, let's start with just this basic idea of how often should we use Ctrl+F on the LSAT? Like broad strokes on how many questions in reading comprehension should we be using Ctrl+F? And this is actually a question that, I've worked with many students on using Ctrl+F and other reading comprehension strategies, but I've never actually had a clear data-based understanding of how many questions does Ctrl+F really help us on. So what I decided to do in anticipation of this webinar was look at the reading comprehension sections of the 8 most recent prep tests. So I looked at prep tests 85 through 92. I read all of the reading comprehension passages. I looked at all of the questions and I looked at all of the answer choices for every single question. And what I wanted to do is really test out whether Ctrl+F made those questions easier. I did every single answer choice and really played with that Ctrl+F function to see if it made answering those questions easier on those 8 most recent practice tests. I kind of cataloged the results, and here's what I found. For 7% of the questions, I found that Ctrl+F makes questions appreciably easier. And by that, I mean, for those questions, I would have definitely used Ctrl+F to answer that question on the test. And not only that, I would recommend the use of Ctrl+F on those questions to just about any test taker without reservations, without hesitation. Now, that's not nothing. That's 7% of the questions. I think there were 216 questions I looked at. That represents, I believe, 15 of the questions. But it's not a lot. It's not most of the questions, right? It's not even a large percentage of the questions. I think we would agree. So if you've heard that, hey, don't even worry about reading comprehension, they let you use Ctrl+F, that's a total game changer, it makes every question much, much easier. That's just not what I found. I found it works for about 7% of the questions. They're a lot easier with reading with Ctrl+F. I really thought that Ctrl+F was the best way to answer that question, but that's not all of the questions. So that might be a little disheartening if you heard that Ctrl+F is this game-changing thing that they let you use. What might be a little bit more heartening, though, is what I found. For about 17% of the questions, Ctrl+F helps confirm that the correct answer is correct. Sorry, 19% of the questions. Ctrl+F helps confirm that the correct answer is correct. So by that, I mean, I don't know if Ctrl+F is the best way to do that question necessarily, but if you're looking at that question and you had an inkling that C was the correct answer, by searching for a word in C, you'd be able to quickly find the support in the passage that confirms that C is indeed the correct answer. So I found that that worked on about 19% of the questions. If you had some reason to prefer a given answer choice, Ctrl+F was a tool that helped you confirm that that was the correct answer choice. Now you have to be smart with which word from that answer choice you choose to search to find that supporting text in the passage. You might have to go through a couple of appearances of that word in that passage to find the supporting text, but Ctrl+F, in my opinion, really helped confirm that the correct answer is correct about 19% of the questions. Now for another 7% of the questions, I found that Ctrl+F didn't really help you confirm that the correct answer is correct. However, it did help confirm that some wrong answer choices were incorrect. Basically, you can use Ctrl+F to find either the part of the passage that confirms that that answer choice is not true or misconstrues some information in the passage, or you can use Ctrl+F to get a strong sense that, hey, the thing that the answer choice is talking about is not discussed in the passage. So Ctrl+F would have helped you eliminate some of those answer choices. And that leaves 67% of the questions on which I found that Ctrl+F just did not help very much. Now, there's a variety of reasons why Ctrl+F doesn't help very much on these questions. For some of these questions, they're just not asking about a specific thing in the passage. They could be asking for a big picture, kind of takeaway point from the passage, like what's the passage's main point, or what's the author's primary purpose in writing this passage. These aren't necessarily details that are in the passage that you can search for and find using Ctrl+F. They're more kind of general points that you need to come up with on your own after reading the entire passage. It could also be a type of question where they're really not asking you for something in the passage at all. They're asking you for like information about why the author included a given paragraph, or they're asking you to take information from the passage and apply it to some analogous situation or to some hypothetical that the passage doesn't explicitly consider. Oftentimes, Ctrl+F doesn't work because it's just not necessary. A lot of questions actually give you line references in both the questions and the answer choices, kind of obviating the need for Ctrl+F. What happened a lot too is that there was many answer choices in which the answer choices really didn't give you any searchable words. Basically, all of the words in those answer choices were not the words used in the passage. So you could be looking for a word like snacks from the answer choice because that was the word the answer choice uses. But that word snacks wasn't in the passage. The passage used a synonymous word like bites or nauseous or something like that. So in those cases, Ctrl+F doesn't help very much because you're searching for a word that's not in the passage, even though the passage is describing that specific idea. And Adriana, by line reference questions, I'll give you an example of that later on in the presentation. But these are questions that are like, what did the author mean when they said crucible on line 27 or in the second sentence of the first paragraph? Those don't really lend themselves well to Ctrl+F. For one reason, you already know where in the passage that is. In fact, the testing interface will highlight that word for you in particular when you get to that question. So you don't need to use Ctrl+F to find that line reference. And a lot of times what they're asking you to do with those line references is either find a synonym of that word, or they're asking you why the author used those words. And Ctrl+F is going to help you come up with either of those points because those points aren't really based on something that's in the passage specifically. You have to more rely on, hey, what's the author's main point? What's their goal in writing the passage? What's the context of this paragraph? You have to worry about those things more. Okay, so wanted to kind of put this chart on the board for you all to kind of, before we get into the 4 principles of using Ctrl+F. So I want us to just be all very clear on the fact that Ctrl+F is a useful tool. It can help on as many as, in my opinion, 33% of the questions. But if you think that this Ctrl+F is going to be something that you could use effectively on every single question, well, I looked at all the most recent questions, the questions that are going to be, in all likelihood, the ones that are most representative of the reading comp questions that you're going to get on your test. And that just wasn't my finding at all. So we need to be smart with how we use this tool. It's a tool that's available to us, but if we're going to use it effectively and to yield more points on this test, we have to be smart with how we practice using it at home. We have to be smart with how we use it on the actual test. And to that point, I've developed 4 principles that I'd like to share with you on using Ctrl+F on the LSAT. These are principles I want you to think about as you practice using Ctrl+F at home, when you're doing homework, when you're doing practice exams, when you're doing timed or untimed sections. Because you shouldn't be practicing using Ctrl+F on every single question, or even worse, on every single answer choice as you practice at home, because you're just not going to have time to use that on the test. And as we just showed you on that chart, most of those questions aren't easier with Ctrl+F. So when you practice Ctrl+F and you're devising your own system of using this tool, here are 4 principles I'd like you to follow. The first principle is that Ctrl+F should supplement the critical reading skills that you need on the LSAT, but it should not replace those critical reading skills. Now, what I found after looking at all of those questions and thinking about how Ctrl+F could help a test taker on those questions, what I found is that Ctrl+F is actually of not much use if you do not understand the passage's main point, the organization of the passage's argument, and the author's opinions. That's because these are the big picture concepts that reading comprehension tests most extensively. A lot of those, 67% of the questions that Ctrl+F didn't really help on, those are questions that were asking about these 3 issues: the main point, the organization, the author's opinions. These are not really things that are explicitly in the passage. They're not asking you to identify a detail that's in the passage. They're not asking you to identify someone's view that was briefly mentioned in the passage. These are things that are asking about these kind of broad, big picture, general points. And searching for specific little details aren't going to help you uncover these big picture points. So we really need to make sure that whether we use Ctrl+F or not, we have a strong understanding of these 3 big picture concepts. A lot of questions are going to ask about them. In fact, even questions that appear to ask about little details can often be answered correctly just by thinking about these big picture concepts. A lot of times, questions appear to be about these little details, but they're actually asking about big picture concepts, the main point, the organization, the author's opinions. So what Ctrl+F kind of does is it kind of takes our attention away from these big picture concepts. It literally highlights these little details, these little words mentioned in the passage. And that kind of has the effect of taking our attention slightly away from these big picture concepts and highlighting the little details. So if we overuse Ctrl+F, what tends to happen is we start focusing too much on the details, and we tend to forget about or overlook these big picture points. So if we're going to use Ctrl+F, it needs to be as a supplement to these big picture points. We need to read the passage, make sure we understand these 3 things. And then if we get any questions that are truly about the little details, then we can use Ctrl+F to find those little details. However, we can't rely exclusively on Ctrl+F. We can't rely on Ctrl+F without thinking about these big points. Sometimes doing that will lead you to answer questions incorrectly. And as a case in point, I want to show you one particular question from Prep Test 85. So I'm going to pull up this test now. This is a passage number 4 from this test. Get to question 26. It's towards the end of the section. Maybe you're running out of time a little bit. And you think, oh, this question says, according to the information in the passage, which one of the following kinds of regions experiences the most earthquakes? Now, even experienced test takers might get to this question and think, oh, this is a great question for Ctrl+F. It's asking about a little detail in the passage. We would classify this at LSATMax as a minor detail question. It's also telling us that that detail is explicitly mentioned in the passage according to information in the passage. They're telling us, hey, this detail is in the passage. So you can use Ctrl+F to find it. So here's what a lot of test takers would do. They would go to Ctrl+F, and they would search most earthquakes, since this is asking about the regions that experience most earthquakes. We can see there are 2 appearances of that phrase in the passage. The first one says most earthquakes can be explained as a result of the grinding of these plates, blah, blah, blah. It's not really about the regions where these earthquakes occur. So that's okay. You look for the next reference to most earthquakes. Most earthquakes take place in Earth's seismic hot zones, regions with very high levels of subduction. So a lot of test takers would say, aha, I used Ctrl+F to find the salient piece of text. I now know that most earthquakes occur in these hot zones, regions with very high levels of subduction. And based on that, I can look for the correct answer choice. I'm just curious, you haven't read this entire passage, at least right now, you haven't read the entire thing. Which answer choice looks good to you? Based on that Ctrl+F, which answer choice would you select? Let me know in the chat section. Regions with high levels of subduction. We're all going with D. Yeah, that's what a lot of test takers do here. A lot of test takers go with answer choice D, regions where there is the greatest amount of subduction. However, if you chose D, you would have gotten this incorrect. Because the passage's main point is actually not that most earthquakes take place in regions with the greatest amount of subductions. We'll actually see right after that reference we found, the author says, contrary to expectations, there's also areas with very high levels of subduction that don't feature very much earthquakes. Really, the main point of this passage is that the amount of subduction doesn't matter as much as the angle of the subduction. So that subduction refers to 2 plates on the Earth's mantle. One kind of goes under the other plate. That creates a lot of resistance. And sometimes that resistance gets released in the form of earthquakes. Their point is it isn't the amount of subduction that causes earthquakes. It's actually the angle of the subduction. So the subduction is kind of at a shallow angle. It creates a lot of resistance. If it's at a steeper angle, there's less resistance and fewer earthquakes. So really the correct answer is C. Because this is a question that looks to be about a specific detail. However, if you read the entire passage, you would realize that the main point is that it's actually the angle of subduction that leads to earthquakes, and that shallower angles lead to more earthquakes. That's what I mean by sometimes Ctrl+F can make your job harder or lead you to the wrong answer. Sometimes Ctrl+F can help you find the correct answer very effectively. But sometimes, especially if we don't remember the main point, it can lead us to get the wrong answer, like so many test takers do on this particular question. Now, so I didn't bring up this particular question to show you that this is how Ctrl+F always works on the LSAT. In fact, on those 33% of the questions that I found that Ctrl+F was helpful, this kind of thing doesn't happen. But I wanted to show you this question to illustrate a pitfall of Ctrl+F. If you use Ctrl+F without thinking of these 3 big picture concepts, you might get the question wrong, where you might not be choosing the fastest, easiest way to answer that question. So that brings up a question of, if this main point in organization and author's attitude is so important, then how do we find it? Well, there's a variety of ways to find the main point in the passage. And it's so crucial that you do. I wanted to share with you a couple of these methods. I did a full webinar on reading comprehension methodologies a few months ago. You can search for that on our YouTube page and learn more about all of these, but I'll briefly go over them right now. There are certain words that might appear in the passage that suggest the main point is about to appear. These are often in the form of conclusion indicator words like thus or therefore or hence or so. These don't appear that often in reading comprehension. They sometimes do. What often appears are what we call pivot words. These are words that authors use to pivot from making one point or acknowledging one viewpoint and then pivoting to their own view. Oftentimes, these words are used to introduce conclusions. We used to use this old approach, but now we found this new approach was better. We used to think earthquakes were caused by the amount of subduction. However, we now know it has to do with the angle of subduction. Although we used to do this, we now know that. There are other kind of structural ways you can think about the main point in the passage. Some test takers prefer to go about this technique. One structural way to think about the main point is just to kind of, after you read the entire passage, think about all the viewpoints that were expressed in the passage. Okay, we had some biologists, we had some chemists, and we had some neurochemists. Okay, there were like 3 different viewpoints. Did the author agree with any of them? If so, if the author agreed with the neurochemists, then the views held by those neurochemists is going to be the main point. If the author didn't agree with any, then a summary of all those viewpoints is going to be the main point. So we can use this kind of viewpoint method to uncover the main point. You can also think about it in terms of what questions a passage is attempting to answer. In that last passage we just looked at, the question was, and this question is actually explicitly stated, but even if the question isn't explicitly stated, you can still think of a question that the passage is trying to answer. In that passage, the question was, why are there not many earthquakes in areas with a lot of subduction? The answer to that question was, well, in those areas, the subduction's angle is very steep. There isn't a lot of resistance. In other areas, the subduction angle is very shallow, creates a lot of resistance. That causes earthquakes. So if you think about, okay, what question is this passage trying to answer? The answer the passage provides will tell you what the main point is. The answer that the author provides or the answer that the author agrees with is going to be the main point. Or if the author doesn't agree with any of the answers described by the passage, the main point is just going to be a summary of the answers provided. Some test takers prefer to just summarize the passage. No, it's easiest for me to come up with the main point if I just summarize the entire passage. And to do that efficiently, looking at the topic sentence of each paragraph can help you do so. There are other ways to uncover the main point of the passage. For instance, at LSATMax, we teach meta structures. We basically looked at every single passage on reading comprehension throughout the LSAT's history. We found about 14 different common arguments that these reading comprehension passages reiterate over and over again. If you become familiar with these 14 different types of arguments, which we call meta structures, it's really like a cheat code or Rosetta Stone to uncovering the passage's main point in organization. So whichever technique works for you for uncovering the main point, we need to make sure that we do find that main point. Because if we use Ctrl+F without thinking about the main point, we might get some questions like question 26 that we just looked at incorrect. We also won't be able to do the many questions that explicitly ask about those big picture main point issues. The organization and the author's opinion is also very important. So it's important that we have a technique to trace that. And to do that, I'm just going to show you a few words that you can focus on in passages. I'm going to use passage 4 from the June 2007 test to illustrate that. So I'm not going to show you the entire passage. In fact, I'm going to black out most of this passage and show that there are a few keywords that indicate the structure of the passage and the author's opinion. That focusing on these specific words can give you that information. So what I have on the screen right now is the first paragraph of this passage, June 2007, passage 4. I've blacked out most of this. We don't know what the topic of this is. We don't know what it's talking about, but we do see the word traditionally. And traditionally is an important structural word on the LSAT. If you do a lot of reading comprehension passages on the LSAT, you'll notice a pattern. You'll notice that very often what these passages like to do is refer to something that's traditional and contrast that with something that's new. And that forms a very common passage structure, this discussion of an old approach versus the discussion of a new approach. So you know right away, just through that word traditional, that, hey, this is the part of the passage where they're talking about a traditional approach. The rest of the passage is probably going to be talking about a new approach. Then also focus on these other phrases that suggest the author's attitude towards that traditional approach. The author says that traditional approach is very fragmentary, scarce, it focuses selectively. These are not positive words. These are words that the author is using to criticize this traditional means of doing whatever it is. So I just know that this paragraph is about the traditional thing, and the author's attitude is that this traditional thing has some problems. Now, looking at the next paragraph, we get another structural word, an additional means. The scene tells us that we're talking about something new, something that can add to the traditional thing that had the problems from the first paragraph. So structurally, now we're talking about something new. And tracking the author's attitude, the author says that this new thing can serve to supplement or correct, presumably the problems created by the old traditional thing. And those are positive words: supplement, adds to, corrects, fixes. We now know that the author in the second paragraph is describing an additional thing, and the author's opinion is that this additional thing seems better. In the next paragraph, we get a structural word, for example. Examples are pieces of evidence that authors use to illustrate their point, so that the example in this third paragraph, whatever it's about, is going to illustrate why that additional thing is better. Fourth paragraph, we get a very similar structural word, another example. We have no idea what that example is, but we do know it's another example that shows that the additional thing is better. And finally, in the last paragraph, the author uses a pivot word, though. Say, okay, now I'm going to pivot away from talking about how this additional thing is better. And now I'm going to talk about the limits, the limitations of this thing. And the author gives an example of such a limitation. But there are limits to how much better the new thing is. Here's an example of that limitation. So just by focusing on these structural words and these evaluative words, these words that express opinions, we can get the organization of the passage without worrying too much about the details. We can get the author's opinion without worrying about too much about the details. And like I said, these are the important things to get. We get these two things, we get the main point, and then we're going to have a really strong foundation to go off of as we answer all of the questions. Now, if we encounter any questions that are about that example from paragraph 3 or 4 or 5, if they're asking about a specific reason that the traditional thing had some problems, we can always use Ctrl+F to supplement that. We can always use Ctrl+F to find that specific detail. But we need to start with these 3 big picture things: the main point, the organization, the author's opinion. That's the first principle. We need those critical reading skills. We need the reading skills that help us identify the main point, author's attitude, and the organization of the passage. And we'll use Ctrl+F to add to that when necessary. All right, principle number 2, judicious use of Ctrl+F is better than overuse. We need to be smart with how we use it. We need to be smart with how we practice using Ctrl+F. Remember, most questions on recent exams are not easy with Ctrl+F. 67% of questions do not lend themselves to Ctrl+F. So knowing when not to use Ctrl+F is just as important as knowing when to use it. So experienced test takers will know which questions are ill-suited to Ctrl+F, and which questions Ctrl+F can help on. So thinking about those things, go through all the different question types on the LSAT and talk about which ones Ctrl+F is effective on, which ones we can use Ctrl+F, which ones we shouldn't even really bother using Ctrl+F. At LSATMax, we categorize these questions into 6 general families. The first family of questions is what we'll call major point questions. These are questions that ask about the main point of the passage or the primary purpose of the passage. So what was this passage trying to tell us? And why did the author write this passage? These are not question types where we should bother using Ctrl+F to help us answer it. Again, we should have the main point understood after reading the passage. That should be one of the big things we're anticipating. Additionally, very often the main point isn't an explicit statement made in the passage. It's something that we kind of have to come up with ourselves. After reading all the viewpoints, after thinking about what question the passage is trying to answer, after kind of considering or summarizing the passage to ourselves, we need to come up with the main point. So trying to search for the main point using Ctrl+F isn't a really effective strategy. It's even more true of these primary purpose questions, which ask us to think abstractly about why the author wrote the passage and how the author wrote the passage. Searching for specific words isn't going to help us answer that. The next category of questions are what we'll refer to as minor point questions. These questions ask usually for more specific details that the author conveyed to help them prove their main point. Now, a lot of these we can use Ctrl+F. Which one of the following does the passage say is usually necessary in order to keep up intense practice? Well, it's telling us the passage said something, so there's going to be a specific claim made in the passage that we want to find to support the right answer. We can use Ctrl+F to find that specific statement in the passage to support the right answer. The passage contains information sufficient to answer which one of the following questions? Well, it tells us the passage has the information that answers this question. The passage has the answer. We can use Ctrl+F to find that answer. The passage suggests that cosmologists mentioned in the 3rd paragraph would be most likely to agree with which one of the following statements? Well, it tells us, hey, the cosmologists have these views. These views were expressed in the passage in the 3rd paragraph. If you need to use Ctrl+F to find the cosmologist's views, you can do that. There is one question that Ctrl+F doesn't really lend itself to in this minor point family. That question is when the passage refers to transliterated terms, line 22, the author most likely means words, blah, blah, blah. Now, you don't really need Ctrl+F on these questions because as you can see, the question tells you where that phrase appears in the passage. So there's no point of using Ctrl+F to find it in the passage. That's not going to help you. And all the answer choices are going to give you synonyms of that phrase, transliterated terms. And it's our job to find the synonym that matches the author's use of the words based on the context of the passage. So none of the words in the answer choices are going to be explicitly made in the passage. So there's really no use of using Ctrl+F to search for those words in the passage. The third category of questions are called argument structure questions in LSATMax curriculum. These questions ask us why the author included a detail, like why did the author refer to alibis in the first sentence of the passage, or why the author included a specific paragraph in the passage, or what the organization of the passage is, or what's a principle that underlines the author's argument. These are questions that Ctrl+F just really does not work for, because these require us to think explicitly about how that passage was organized. What was the author trying to accomplish in the first paragraph? What was the author trying to accomplish in the second paragraph? What was the author trying to accomplish with this detail? Where is the author's pieces of evidence? Where is the author's conclusion? That's what these questions want us to find out. So Ctrl+F isn't going to help us find any of that information because the author never comes out and says, in this paragraph, I will be giving you my conclusion. And in this paragraph, I will be giving you my evidence. And the reason I'm going to talk about alibis is to support a conclusion I made 2 paragraphs ago. The author doesn't do that in the passage, so you really can't search for the answers to these questions using Ctrl+F. Next category of questions are tone questions. These questions ask us about what the author would agree with, or what's the author's attitude towards various topics in the passage. Now, some of these questions ask you what the author would be most likely to agree with. These are questions that we can use Ctrl+F on. We can use Ctrl+F to find where the author talked about a topic an answer choice brings up, and see if the author would agree with that answer choice based on the author's discussion of that topic in the paragraph. But for other questions, ask us about the author's attitude. You can see at the end of this list which one of the following most accurately characterizes the author's attitude towards the draft articles. Now, these answer choices are going to use kind of like brief phrases to characterize the author's opinions. The author has qualified admiration. The author has explicit approval. The author has strict neutrality. The author has strongly negative views. Those words are not in the passage. Those are words that we have to come up with by noticing the author's attitude in the passage, by noticing the author's word choice, by noticing the tone that the author has. So Ctrl+F doesn't really work for the author's attitude style questions in the tone family, although it can help for the questions that ask us what the author would be most likely to agree with. The next category of questions is called application questions. And these questions really ask us to go outside of the passage in an explicit way. They either ask us to take some information from the passage and apply it to an outside context, like what is an analogous situation that's similar to something in the passage, or they ask us to take information from the passage and apply it to some hypothetical that the passage didn't explicitly address, or they ask us to take the answer choices and apply them to the passage, see if it would strengthen or weaken something in the passage. Because this family of application questions ask us to go outside of the passage, trying to use Ctrl+F to find something inside of the passage just isn't really the right tool for the job. The last category of questions is extension questions. These are rare, but they show up occasionally. They actually ask us to extend the passage, find the answer choice that would most logically complete the last paragraph or add to the passage. And again, because these ask us to go outside of the passage, using Ctrl+F to look for something inside of the passage isn't very helpful. So as you can see, there are a lot of questions where we shouldn't even bother using Ctrl+F. Knowing what those questions are and using the other tools in our toolbox will help us avoid these unproductive, time-wasting uses of Ctrl+F and save the uses of Ctrl+F for the questions on which Ctrl+F can be productive. Principle number 3 is related to principle number 2, but overusing Ctrl+F, especially on wrong answers, can slow you down way too much. As we saw in that initial chart, it was only about 7% of the questions that Ctrl+F helped you eliminate wrong answer choices. In working with students, one of the biggest misperceptions I notice is that Ctrl+F is a particularly effective tool to confirm that a wrong answer is wrong. But it doesn't really work at doing that. Ctrl+F is not terribly useful at eliminating wrong answer choices, because Ctrl+F only tells you that a specific word isn't in the passage. If you search for transliteration and it's not in the passage, no results come up, it doesn't mean that concept didn't appear in the passage. It just means that the author didn't use that specific word. So for that reason, Ctrl+F tends to not be terribly useful at eliminating wrong answer choices. It's using a tool for the job that the tool just simply wasn't built for. So to avoid overusing Ctrl+F, a tip that I would give you all is to try to only look back at the passage at most once per question. If If you're trying to use Control+F on every single answer choice, on every single question, you're overusing that tool, you're slowing yourself down too much, and you're using that tool in a context that the tool just doesn't really work that well in. So instead, try to limit your use of Control+F to anticipating what the correct answer will say, or confirming that the answer choice you think is in fact supported by the passage. After looking at all of these passages, I found that this was the most productive use for Control+F by far. So try to limit your use of Control+F to that. So if you're not going to use Control+F to eliminate wrong answer choices, what should you do? Even on like those detail questions that are asking about some specific detail in the passage. Well, a far more effective technique to use to eliminate wrong answer choices on these questions is just think about those big picture items again. First thing you can think of is this answer choice consistent with the passage's main point? Even on questions that are asking about some detail in the passage, a lot of the times you can eliminate an answer choice because that detail just doesn't really conform to the passage's main point. The detail is irrelevant to the main point. The idea that that detail would serve as inconsistent or contradictory to the main point. If that's what the detail is doing, that answer choice is almost certainly wrong. So you can eliminate that answer choice, or at least be quite confident that that answer choice is wrong without even thinking about where that detail is in the passage, without even researching where that detail is in the passage. You just think, you know what, the way that the author is talking about this detail, or sorry, the way this answer choice is talking about the detail is not consistent with the main point, so I can eliminate it. Now, sometimes the detail will be consistent with the main point, and then we can start thinking about the passage's organization. Does the answer choice bring up something that's relevant to the passage's conclusions or premises? The author is using this example and this example to prove something about this additional way of doing things. Do any of these details have to do with those two examples? Does either of these details have to do with the conclusion that the author reaches about the additional thing? If not, if that answer choice seems beyond the scope of that passage's organization, that answer choice is almost certainly wrong. You don't have to worry about reviewing the passage to get confirmation that it's wrong. Just by knowing that it doesn't fit within the organization, you'll know that it's incorrect. However, if the answer choice is consistent with the main point, if it's in line with the passage's organization, then you can check if it's supported by the text. Then you can look in the text and see if it has that explicit support, and you can use Control+F to do so if you want to. But by using those first two questions, is this consistent with the main point? Does this conform to the organization? You'll be able to eliminate a lot of answer choices that have without having to look back at the passage at all. And then you won't be relying on researching the passage or overusing Control+F to confirm that that answer choice is incorrect. And that's going to take us to our final principle, which is that it's ultimately your tool to use. Control+F is a tool that you get to use on your test. So you should practice and discover the system that works for you. Now, based on the questions I looked at, after working with many students, after discussing this idea with many different instructors, I've devised my own recommendations that I think can help you avoid some of the common pitfalls and misconceptions about Control+F. But you ultimately need to devise the system that works for you. You're the most qualified to devise this system. You're the person who's going to be using the system. You're the person that gets to pick which kinds of questions you use it on, what kinds of things you search for, how often you use it. You might decide to use Control+F on almost every single question that Control+F can make easier. You might decide that you'll never use it. The point I want to leave you with is that you need to practice. You need to find the system that works for you. You need to refine that system to make sure that it continues to work for you. You need to test the system to see if you can find a way that can work better for you. And as long as the system you devise increases your accuracy without sacrificing your speed, it can be an effective system. So ultimately, we all might come to slightly different conclusions as to what questions we would use Ctrl+F on and how exactly we might use Ctrl+F to make those questions easier. Now, we should all do our best to conform to the principles that I gave you. We should use it on the right times. We should be judicious with our use. We shouldn't overuse it. We shouldn't use it on to confirm that incorrect answer choices are incorrect. But beyond that, we really do want to devise our own system that works for us, because ultimately it's our test to take, and we need to use the tools that we feel most comfortable with. By the way, that is true on a lot of strategies in reading comprehension: highlighting, underlining, taking notes, anticipation. Ultimately, instructors like us can give you our recommendations based on what's worked for us, what's worked for our students, but ultimately, you'll have to take that advice and make your own system, and that's going to yield you the most points. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is just speaking with your proctor about Ctrl+F. If you ultimately decide that your system does involve the use of Ctrl+F, you're going to want to make sure that you have the option to use Ctrl+F on the real test. As I mentioned at the beginning of today's presentation, there have been some instances in which Ctrl+F has not been allowed by proctors. And I think basically every single one of those instances could have been avoided if the test taker just had a simple conversation with their proctor. So what I want to talk about right now is how to have that conversation with the proctor to make sure that you get the opportunity to use Ctrl+F if you would like to do so. So what you should do is have a conversation with your proctor before the test begins. Now, when you have this conversation with your proctor, do not assume that your proctor knows more about the LSAT than you do. And those proctors, they have a hard job. They have to proctor a lot of tests with a lot of people, and all those people have different computer configurations that they might be using. All the tests that they're proctoring have slightly different rules. So the proctors might not always be completely up to date on all of the rules on every single one of the tests that they administer. So when you have this conversation with your proctor, don't ask, can I use Ctrl+F during this exam? You already know the answer to that question. You know that you can. What you want to find out is if your proctor knows that you can. What you want to confirm is that your proctor is not going to do anything that prevents you from using that Ctrl+F function during the exam. So don't ask, can I use Ctrl+F during an exam? You're assuming that the proctor knows more about you, when that might not be true. If the proctor says no, you don't really have a good response to that. You can't be like, well, actually, I think I can. Instead, say, I want to confirm that you're aware that LSAC allows test takers to use Ctrl+F during the test. Therefore, please do not disable my keyboard, as that will prevent me from using this permitted function. This is the question that's going to show the proctor that you understand the rules of the test. It's going to help you find out that the proctor also is aware of that rule of the test. And you're giving the proctor specific instructions as to not disable your computer's keyboard to make sure that you can use Ctrl+F during the test. Now, if your proctor pushes back and says, well, actually, you can't use Ctrl+F, I was not aware of that rule, tell them to check with LSAC. Tell them to get in contact with their LSAC representative to confirm that you're allowed to use that. LSAC will say, yes, the test taker can use Ctrl+F. No, you should not disable the keyboard unless something goes awry during the test, and you'll be allowed to use Ctrl+F. If for whatever reason the proctor still doesn't allow you to use Ctrl+F, well, guess what? You can file a test day complaint, and LSAC will give you a chance to retake the test, usually within about a week of the actual exam. But hopefully just by asking that first question, really just stating the first statement, I want to confirm that you're aware that LSAC allows test takers to use Ctrl+F. That will make sure that the proctor allows you to use it so you can yield some points with the effective use of Ctrl+F. And that's our presentation today. Thank you all for hanging out, learning more about Ctrl+F. I went a lot longer than I thought. Yeah, hopefully you learned a lot more about Ctrl+F. For the rest of the presentation, You can ask me anything about the LSAT. Happy to talk about anything related to the LSAT, LSATMax, law school admissions, anything like that. I do see we have some questions already in the Q&A section. While we go over the questions in this section, I'm just going to put on our board the LSAT course, LSATMax courses that are available to you. Do you have a great course that you can use to learn how to do all three of the sections of the LSAT, including reading comprehension. We'll teach you all about the different question types, all about the skills that you'll need to rock reading comprehension, logical reasoning, and logic games. We do that through over 1,000 hours of video between our course and all the office hours we host every day. We do that through all 92 prep tests available on our platform. You can take as many times as you want to get detailed explanations to help you uncover the LSAT secret. And we do it with a whole lot of support. We do it, although you can take the tests, although you can take our course at your own pace, on your own time, you'll have a ton of support available to you. We have daily office hours where our amazing team of instructors go over their personal tips and secrets on various parts of the exam. We have those same instructors who can do tutoring with you. Most of our packages, as you can see, include 1 free hour of private tutoring. We have message boards and Discord boards where you can ask me and some of our other instructors questions about some of the LSAT material you encounter. And we have in-depth analytics to help you find out which parts of the LSAT you're doing great on, and which parts of the LSAT you need a little bit more help on. So all of those allow us to offer a higher score guarantee with our packages. And as you read this page, learn a little bit more about our packages available. All right, let's see. So we've got some questions in the Q&A section now. First question is from an anonymous attendee. I think I answered this during the passage, but I'll address it. Does the LSAT typically use the same words in the passage as the answer choice? What questions are the best? So the LSAT sometimes uses the same words in the passage as the answer choice, but sometimes they don't. And that, as I discussed in this presentation, is a major limitation of the use of Ctrl+F, especially to confirm that incorrect answer choices are incorrect. Yeah, an answer choice might use a certain word that the passage never used. So searching for that word from the answer choice might not yield any results in the passage. But that doesn't mean that answer choice is wrong. That just means that answer choice uses a word that the passage never did. So there is that major limitation to Ctrl+F that we need to be aware of, and we need to form our use of Ctrl+F around that. Next question is from Leslie. Leslie asked, I'm taking the LSAT in August. I've been studying, but not too much. Do I still have time to study and get a good score? That's going to depend entirely on your goals, Leslie, what you're scoring right now in your practice exams, what your goal score is. I will say most test takers do study for longer than 2 months. So you are on a kind of a compressed time frame as it is. But if you'd like to talk specifically about how to form an effective study schedule, I definitely recommend getting in touch with some of our representatives at LSATMax. We can kind of get you set up, talk about whether you should take this test in August, whether you should maybe try to take a later date, and get you situated with a plan to make sure that you get your target score. All right, looks like that was all the questions. So with that, I will part. I hope I want to thank y'all again for hanging out, learning about Ctrl+F. I hope hopefully you can develop your own system to use Ctrl+F effectively. If you have any more questions about the LSAT, I encourage you strongly to check out LSATMax. We have a ton of great customer service representatives to help you get situated. You can also join our courses, talk to me on the Discord board, talk to our instructors over office hours, learn more about the LSAT. And with all of that, I want to wish you all the best of luck. studying for the LSAT. Take care.